Ys VIII is one of the newer installations in the slasher Ys game series by Nihon Falcom. For me it is the 5th game I've played in the series, but the first proper 3D one outside of the pseudo 3D graphics that Origin and Untitled Chapter had. It was localized by NIS America, being released in 2018 in the West after some delays for the sake of fixing PC performance. The game very much reflects the common tropes of the Ys series and Falcom as a company as well, being to an extent similar to series such as The Legend of Heroes in terms of the general systems you may find, such as mini social link type events or the traditional equipment of Falcom RPGs of 2 gear slots and 2 accessories. Being the first proper 3D Ys game that I've played, I wanted to give my review regarding the systems and general story in the first half of the game. There won't be any major spoilers, but this video is more orientated towards being an introduction to the game generally. There will be another video detailing what I loved about the story, especially its format of doing so, and that video will be rife with spoilers. First major aspect of Ys VIII I want to mention is the story, which is a rare part for me to begin with, considering all the Ys games I've played up until now haven't been particularly unique or have a deep story due to its episodic game development. Each game, save for 1, 2 and Origin, have their own story and effectively own world which the game takes place in when you consider backstories and the world building. These games do not present a narrative aside from the first 3 between them. However, in comparison to Untitled Chapter or the Land of Ys trilogy, the story is much more fleshed out and the format of storytelling is much more unique than what I'm used to. The extent of world building achieved in a single game is also very nice. The story, beware, is a very slow burn. You very much have to be intrigued into other areas of the game or trust in Falcom as a developer to be able to constantly continue through the game until it gets good, as the famous phrase goes. As a brief introduction, the game takes place on the Isle of Siren, a seemingly uncharted and restricted area for the nautical community. Adol and Dogi, our well-established duo by now in the series, have crash-landed on the island alongside various civilians and sailors on the liner they were taking to another country. Those on board have washed up in different areas around the large island, and Adol's first call to action is to find some other people. Shortly afterwards, the captain meets Adol, and they establish a village to centralize survivors and create a makeshift community where they can figure out an escape plan and unite anyone who was lost on the island. This sanctuary on the Isle of Siren serves as a home base for Adol, both heavily being used and referenced in the story and the gameplay throughout the journey. The community being built here and the extraordinary circumstances that they face really brings out certain qualities and personality traits within the community that grows throughout the game. This gives everyone a defining role and quality as you find out their strengths and jobs prior to landing on the isle. This creates a sense of mystery as the ragtag group grows their village that they had created, leading to eventual moments of contention throughout. The game starts out on this idea, and my criticism is that it remains in this section for way too long, and it can likely lose the faith of players purely because of how long the game spends on this section, or the main plot shines through. Despite this criticism, time together with your party and with those who crash landed with you really fleshes them out, and you start to develop opinions about each person and how useful they may be, how cocky they seem, and how useless they are. All of this serves as background though, as alluded to prior. Throughout the game there is some hint drops to the major plot in the forms of visions that Adol seemingly has every night. There plays a blue-haired girl living in some kind of ancient civilization who regularly uses some kind of magic throughout the visions. After learning some background of the maiden via these visions, Adol and the crew eventually start finding ruins and signs of human life on the island, which is thought to be all but abandoned save for the occasional shipwreck which made it there. What really makes this plot interesting is that eventually the girl that Adol is seeing visions of starts to have visions about Adol in the future, and they soon realise that their future is intertwined. Thus starts the main plot of the game, as either side tries to figure out what the significance of these visions are, and Adol tries to figure out why it's only him having this vision, and the girl in question tries to figure out why she is seeing her civilization in the future in ruins. The storytelling is very unique in my own experiences, and whilst it's very common for me to see elements of time travel or timelines being used in games, I rarely see both two people, one of a bygone era and one of the present, seeing each other's circumstances. This is what really made me realise that Ys had started developing a more attractive story the further it went into the series, and I was very welcoming of it. That's the furthest I'll go on, and will refer to the intricacies of the plot in a separate video. I just wanted to highlight my delight with seeing well, Ys at least, quite a unique storytelling device being used, despite the long startup of the game. You play in both timelines, which varies up the gameplay due to the playstyle of each character, but also gives you a break from the empty Isle of Siren in the future. Now that the story has been laid out to some degree, the gameplay, which Ys is very much recognised for, is some of the greatest I've played in slasher JRPG history. The simplicity and lack of systems is the game's strength when in combat. Much like how Dark Souls or From Software games generally lend themselves to creating simple yet enjoyable repeatable combat, Lacrimosa of Dana utilises a relatively simple JRPG slasher combat system that makes it smooth and so simply engaging that it just feels fantastic to run about in, but also provides some room for optimization and skill. It also gives you choice depending on your playstyle and what difficulty you are playing on. The game has the usual slasher game abilities. Square for PS enters into a basic combos which will deal damage but also build SP. SP is a gauge which can be used for your main skills, which have their own effects, damage levels and stun capabilities, bound neatly to R1, then square, X, triangle, circle in combination with R1. This can be entered into mid combo and mid animation. Most animations in this game are cancelable, which really makes it smooth and it doesn't feel like you're anchored down to attacks, making combat feel weightless to maneuver within, but also heavy and damaging when you deal critical hits or with your skills. If you press R1 and L1, it uses your gauge which will give you a cutscene, depending on whose party member it is, attack that will do heavy damage, also freeze enemies in place during its cast. This forms the basis of your offensive abilities in Ys VIII. You have two evasion or mitigation techniques to use in response to enemy attacks. L1 is a rolling dodge which, if timed correctly, will enter you into a flash dodge state. It allows you to move a lot faster, your animations will be faster, and the enemy will be put into slow motion. You will also become immune to damage. R1, if pressed on impact with an enemy attack, will put you into a Flashguard state. This makes you immune to damage but gives you massive critical hits for the time displayed. Both of these can be used in conjunction, and they both have their own uses. This is also true with super attacks. Using super attacks in these periods will give you massive damage. One final thing to mention is the character damage types. Each effectively are assigned to a slashing, piercing or bludgeoning damage type, which will improve their effectiveness against certain enemies. Bludgeoning does more damage against shelled or harder targets, slashing does more damage against softer targets, and piercing will damage flying targets a lot more. This isn't always a thing to consider, but some enemies will take drastically less or more damage unless you use the corresponding type of damage. Doing enough damage in this kind of case will stun and break the target, allowing for some big damage whilst they are stunned on the ground. The bosses in this game are very fun when using this combat system, and unlike prior Ys games where playing on Nightmare would guarantee you have to farm up, otherwise you wouldn't do much damage, in this, Nightmare mode can be a lot more flexible if you use your damage increasing items, Flashguard, Flash Dodge and good skills together, which will net you massive damage. One other thing to mention about gameplay is the speed at which everything resolves at. Ador can move quite fast if you can combine the sprint and the roll and the jump, which makes jumping between combat encounters and AoE fights very satisfying as you group up enemies to hit enemies with your big skills. Aside from this, Ys VIII follows the usual Ys formula of going from area to area, fighting occasional bosses, otherwise killing normal mobs for XP. Naturally, since this is my first Ys game in 3D, the resource collection, the node harvesting and the crafting system is new to me, but this is done very smoothly, and if you have your own farming route set up, you can collect some really strong resources for use later in the game. The trade up or trade down system back at camps mean farming is rarely ever wasted because you can convert low quality goods into high quality goods later on in the game. There's also various collectibles which come from crafting in the form of side quests, bombardier members, crafting materials, chests and more. There are simple mechanics which were very enjoyable to 100%, and on the map it shows you a nice list in each area of what you've missed. I found myself within the game collecting fish, nodes, characters, side quests, point of interest because the Isle is a very fun place to explore outside of objectives, and building up your sanctuary is an enjoyable task in itself, especially since they pay dividends later on in the game. Gameplay is strongly backed by the, once again, consistently fantastic music of Falcom JDK, and in a very Ys fashion you get some absolute bangers in areas and boss fights which complements the combat and makes it feel like you're grinding down mobs in typical Ys fashion. The smoothness of combat and the inclusion of such amazing music really makes the game worth playing, and the simplicity of it all just shows how good some core mechanics need to be to make combat so brilliant. As usual, music can switch from being somber to some of the best tracks and most hype tracks you've ever heard. NIS did a fantastic job doing the same with the dub localization. The voice actresses and actors give a brilliant performance in the comedic aspect and the serious parts of the game. Overall, Ys VIII seems to be a very slow starting game with a fantastic payoff at the end, which is very common among Falcom games nowadays it seems. As a result, I'd highly recommend you check out Ys, and if you still aren't convinced, then take a look at my story video, which will come out soon.